He did not fight for a single tribe. He did not fight for a single river. He did not fight for a single homeland. Tecumseh fought for an idea no one had ever made real, a continent that would no longer be divided. At the turn of the 19th century, while the United States expanded west one treaty at a time, Tecumseh traveled thousands of miles, trying to build something history had never seen, a united native resistance, not an alliance, a civilization. Here on Fragments of History, we explore the leaders who tried to change the direction of history itself. If you value cinematic historical storytelling, subscribe and leave a like to support this project. In 1800, the United States was not yet a continental power. It was a thin strip of settlements clinging to the Atlantic coast, separated from the Pacific by thousands of miles of territory held by indigenous nations who had lived there for millennia. But the new republic carried something more dangerous than raw military strength. A philosophy of expansion, dressed up as destiny and treated as inevitability. The method was refined in its brutality. Negotiators would approach a leader, offer payment for a portion of land, and set ink to paper. Sometimes that leader had the authority to agree, often he did not. Sometimes borders were defined, more often they were left conveniently unclear, and always the language contained openings, clauses that could be interpreted later in ways that made the next seizure feel legal. Each treaty pushed the frontier a little farther west. Each new boundary became temporary by design. The pattern repeated with mechanical certainty. Settlers crossed into treaty-protected land, violence followed, and Washington demanded another treaty to resolve the conflict by taking more territory. Across the continent, native nations watched this process eat the map. The Iroquois Confederacy, once powerful enough to shape colonial politics, had been weakened and divided until its leverage turned brittle. The Cherokee adopted American-style government and agriculture to prove they could coexist, and discovered it changed nothing. The Creek, Chickasaw, Miami, Shawnee, different languages, different histories, same pressure. The terms varied. The outcome did not. What made American expansion especially devastating was its relentlessness. European empires had often been satisfied with trading posts, alliances, and indigenous buffer zones against rivals. The United States wanted something cleaner, possession, not partnerships, not negotiated coexistence, replacement. Indigenous societies would not be incorporated. They would be moved aside, broken apart, or erased, and the land would be remade into American farms and towns, as if no one had ever belonged to it. That kind of conquest required more than soldiers. It required collapse. Native economies were tied to hunting, fishing, and seasonal agriculture, rooted in specific territories. As those territories shrank, the system failed. Hunting grounds that had fed communities for generations became fenced parcels. Fishing sites became mill towns. Sacred spaces were converted into property lines, measured, sold, and defended by law. Trade became a weapon. The fur economy that had brought guns and metal tools also became a lever. American traders extended credit with an understanding that debt would accumulate faster than repayment was possible. When payment came due, land cessions followed. Government agents encouraged reliance on imported goods, then used that reliance in negotiations as pressure, sign or be cut off. It was economic warfare, designed to make self-sufficiency feel like a memory. Military force reinforced the squeeze. A network of forts projected American power deep into indigenous territory. These were not merely defensive structures. They were claims made in timber and stone, staging grounds for expeditions, reminders that the Republic did not intend to leave. When resistance rose, campaigns followed that did not distinguish between combat and survival. Villages were burned, food stores destroyed, non-combatants killed as a matter of policy. The goal was not only to defeat fighters, it was to make endurance impossible. Yet the most corrosive tactic was political. Many native nations relied on consensus, broad agreement across leaders, families, and factions. The United States negotiated with individuals who might represent only a portion of their people, then treated the signature as binding on everyone. Dissent became internal, and internal disagreement became an opening. When disputes emerged over what a treaty meant, American courts decided. Indigenous legal traditions, oral agreements, sacred obligations, none of it carried weight inside a system built to legitimize dispossession. The outcome was predetermined because the framework assumed American sovereignty over land that had never been genuinely surrendered. So the continent fractured. Tribes negotiated separately, accepted different terms, and fought alone. The United States did not need to defeat a unified front, because no unified front existed. It only needed to apply pressure patiently, one nation at a time, until resistance became a series of isolated fires that could be smothered, extinguished, and forgotten. By 1800, the truth was hard to avoid. The frontier was not a meeting place between equals. It was a moving wall. Treaties were not durable agreements between sovereign powers. They were pauses, brief silences between the next demands. Nations that believed cooperation could preserve autonomy were not naive because they lacked intelligence. They were naive because they were negotiating with a project that did not recognize their right to remain. Some leaders understood this with painful clarity. They had watched the pattern repeat too many times to believe in good faith. They saw territory shrinking, communities weakened by disease, young warriors exhausting themselves in conflicts that ended the same way. Traditional responses, seasonal warfare, diplomacy between rival empires, adapting to shifting trade, could not stop an enemy whose objective was replacement. But understanding the danger was not the same as having an answer. No indigenous society in North America had created political structures capable of uniting dozens of distinct nations, different languages, rival histories, old wounds, into a single coordinated force. The Iroquois Confederacy had come closest, but even it was regional, limited by geography and language. There was no proven model for a continental unity that could match a continental appetite. Into this crisis, the Shawnee nation produced two brothers who would attempt what had never been made real. One would ignite a spiritual movement that rejected the European world entirely. The other would move across the continent, carrying an argument as sharp as a blade. The land could not be sold by pieces because it did not belong to any one tribe alone. Together, they would push closer than anyone to halting expansion through indigenous unity. But they would be fighting more than soldiers and settlers. They would be fighting centuries of intertribal conflict, economies already entangled in American trade, and the quiet psychological weight of watching an ancestral world be dismantled in plain sight. The question was never simply whether they could win a battle. The deeper question was whether they could create something that did not yet exist, a political consciousness that saw indigenous peoples not as separate nations bargaining for survival, but as a single civilization defending its right to remain. That would require changing how communities understood themselves, their relationship to land, and their obligations to peoples they had sometimes fought for generations. It would require convincing the cautious that unity was not just necessary, but possible, and it would require one man to travel farther, speak more precisely, and surrender more completely than any leader before him, not to save a single tribe, but to preserve the possibility that the continent might remain indigenous in ways that mattered. His name was Tecumseh, and his story begins in a world already being taken, where the future was visible, the danger was undeniable, and time was running faster than anyone wanted to admit. Tecumseh was born in 1768 in the Ohio River Valley, into a world already at war. The Shawnee had been fighting for survival for generations, not against a single enemy, but against the westward pressure of colonial expansion that never stopped building. By the time he drew his first breath, his people had already been driven from ancestral ground in the southeast and were struggling to hold territory in the Ohio country, land that would soon be contested by the newly independent United States. His father, Pucashinwau, was a war chief who understood what his son's generation would face. The Shawnee were not numerous compared to nations like the Cherokee or the Iroquois. They endured through movement, tactical instinct, and refusal. Pucashinwau fought in raids and battles that blurred into a single long defense, teaching his sons that submission was not survival. It was extinction. The Shawnee would bend to no one. In 1774, when Tecumseh was 6, his father was killed at the Battle of Point Pleasant during Lord Dunmore's War, a conflict driven by Virginia's determination to open Kentucky to settlement despite Shawnee claims. Pucashinwau died in a war he knew would continue after him, defending land that would be taken no matter how many fights the Shawnee won. The lesson settled early. A victory could be real and still be meaningless. Winning a battle did not stop the frontier. And the frontier did not move because of one treaty or one defeat. It moved because tribes fought alone, while settlers and soldiers exploited every fracture between indigenous nations. After their father's death, Tecumseh's older brother, Chicksika, became his primary teacher. Chicksika was a warrior in the traditional mold, brave, skilled, devoted to defending Shawnee territory through force. He took Tecumseh on raids against frontier settlements and taught him how to travel without being seen, how to read the forest like a map, how to strike quickly and vanish before larger forces could gather. But Tecumseh learned something Chicksika did not mean to teach. He learned the difference between courage and strategy. Burning cabins and ambushing supply wagons inflicted pain, but it did not slow expansion. For every settlement destroyed, more arrived. For every soldier killed, replacements followed. The Shawnee could win engagements and still lose the war that decided everything. By his late teens, Tecumseh had become a formidable warrior. In the 1790s, during the Northwest Indian War, he fought alongside a tribal confederation trying to hold the line against American expansion into the Ohio Territory. He witnessed St. Clair's defeat in 1791, a disaster for the United States, a rare moment when indigenous forces annihilated an American army in open battle. It should have changed the direction of history. It did not. The United States raised a larger force, learned, adapted, and returned under Anthony Wayne. In 1794, at Fallen Timbers, Wayne's professional army shattered the Confederation. The message was blunt. America could absorb defeats that would have destroyed smaller nations, then come back heavier, better organized, and harder to stop. In 1795, Tecumseh watched the Treaty of Greenville carve away most of present-day Ohio. Defeated chiefs signed. Tecumseh refused. He was not a chief. He held no authority to decide. But his refusal was not about status. It was about principle, a rejection of the idea that land could be surrendered in exchange for temporary quiet. This was the turning point where his worldview hardened into doctrine. The problem was not bravery. Indigenous warriors had proven themselves equal to any soldiers they faced. The problem was division. Tribes negotiated separately, fought separately, and were defeated separately. What happened to the Miami did not mobilize the Creek. What happened to the Shawnee did not rouse the Cherokee. Each nation watched another fall and hoped privately it could avoid the same fate. Tecumseh saw that hope as fatal misunderstanding. The United States was not negotiating between equals. It was administering a process, the systematic removal of indigenous peoples from a continent it had already claimed in its mind. Treaties were not solutions, they were steps. Each signature was treated as permission for the next demand, so Tecumseh began speaking differently in councils. He argued that no single tribe owned the land in the way Americans described ownership. The continent belonged to all indigenous peoples collectively, and no leader, no matter how respected, had the right to cede territory that sustained everyone. It was a radical idea, not only because it defied American claims, but because it challenged indigenous traditions of sovereignty rooted in distinct nations and defined homelands. People listened even when they resisted his logic. Tecumseh was physically imposing, tall, athletic, difficult to ignore, but his real power was in speech. He spoke with clarity that cut through exhaustion and grief, drawing on images from the natural world and the shared experience of loss. He did not ask people to admire him. He asked them to see what was happening to them. He also shaped his life into an argument. Tecumseh refused to torture prisoners, a practice common in the violence of the frontier on both sides. He treated captives with restraint and sometimes released them. He refused alcohol, seeing it as a tool that dulled judgment and weakened resistance. He lived without ostentation, not accumulating trade goods as a display of status. That discipline was not incidental. Tecumseh understood that a continental alliance could not be built on fear or spectacle. It required moral authority. Leaders would not risk everything for a man they saw as merely another fighter. They might risk everything for someone who embodied a standard, someone whose conduct made unity feel honorable, not desperate. But charisma and principle did not erase centuries of rivalry. The Shawnee and the Iroquois had been enemies. The Creek and the Cherokee had disputed territory. Northern nations distrusted southern nations. Language barriers turned negotiation into strain. Religious practices diverged. And everywhere there were leaders who believed their older methods, selective alliances, careful treaties, limited accommodation, had worked before and could work again. Tecumseh needed more than a political argument. He needed a force that could reach beneath diplomacy and touch identity, a movement that could make unity feel unavoidable, not merely advisable, something that could turn strategy into obligation. That force came from an unexpected source, his younger brother, Tenskwatawa, a man who had been ridiculed, a man whose failures were public, an alcoholic whose life looked like a cautionary tale. In 1805, Tenskwatawa experienced a vision that transformed him into a spiritual leader, and his message began to spread with a speed that politics could not match. Tecumseh, the warrior and diplomat, recognized what his brother's revival could become, a tool to make unity not just necessary, but sacred. Together, they would create something unprecedented, a movement where political unification and cultural renewal fed the same fire, where resistance became more than survival and began to resemble a rebirth. But first, Tecumseh had to make his brother understand that the vision could not end at personal redemption. This was not one man's salvation story. It was a civilization fighting erasure, one treaty, one concession, one surrender at a time, while the continent fractured around it. The question was whether a spiritual movement born from one man's revelation could overcome political fragmentation, economic dependence, and old wars remembered in blood, and whether it could do it fast enough to matter. Tenskwatawa had been a failure by every measure his society valued. Born Lalawethika, he makes a loud noise. He lost an eye in a childhood accident, sank into alcoholism, and failed as both warrior and healer. While Tecumseh earned respect through battlefield skill and disciplined speech, Tenskwatawa became a cautionary figure. The brother people pitied, the man who could not find a place in a world already coming apart. Then, in April 1805, something shifted. Tenskwatawa fell into a trance so deep his family believed he had died. For hours he lay motionless while relatives began preparing his burial. When he suddenly revived, he said he had crossed into the spirit world and returned with a vision meant to save indigenous peoples from destruction. What he brought back was not a military plan, it was a demand for total renewal. The Master of Life, he said, had shown him that indigenous nations were suffering not because they lacked courage or strength, but because they had abandoned the ways their ancestors lived before Europeans arrived. Every compromise, Adopting white clothing, white tools, white alcohol, white religion was not adaptation. It was betrayal. And betrayal had consequences that spread through bodies, families, and land. The vision prescribed reforms with the precision of a command. Indigenous peoples must reject European goods, keeping only firearms for hunting and defense. They must stop drinking alcohol, which he said had been made specifically to destroy them. They must return to traditional dress, traditional foods, and traditional farming without metal plows. They must reject Christianity and return to indigenous spiritual practice. And most controversially, they must reject private property and tribal exclusivity over land. He renamed himself Tenskwatawa, the prophet, and began preaching with an intensity that stunned those who remembered him as a drunk and a disappointment. He did not speak like a negotiator testing arguments. He spoke like a man carrying certainty, as if doubt itself were a form of disobedience. His message was not coexistence. It was separation, purification, a hard boundary between indigenous life and the corrosive presence that was undoing it. The timing could not have been more fertile. By 1805, indigenous communities across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley were in crisis. Game populations had collapsed under the strain of fur trade overhunting. Disease had killed thousands. Alcohol addiction hollowed out families. Traditional authority weakened under pressure from missionaries and government agents who rewarded compliant leaders and isolated resistors. The prophet offered an explanation that fit indigenous spiritual logic. The suffering was not inevitable. It was punishment, the result of broken relationships with the spirit world. And the cure was not accommodation, it was refusal. Return to the old ways, and the master of life would restore balance and drive the Americans back across the mountains. The movement spread with alarming speed. Spiritual leaders from other nations traveled to hear him. Converts returned home carrying the same message: renewal, rejection, and a future that did not require surrender. Within months, Tenskwatawa had followers among the Delaware, Miami, Wyandot, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other nations across the region. But it was never only spiritual. It was political from the moment it left his mouth. And Tecumseh understood its potential immediately. Tenskwatawa provided the sacred frame. Tecumseh shaped what it meant in the world of treaties and guns. If the land belonged to all indigenous peoples, then no single tribe could sell it. If unity was commanded by the master of life, then old intertribal rivalries were not tradition, they were sin. If rejecting white influence was necessary for survival, then leaders who signed treaties and accepted annuities were not realists. They were collaborators. In 1808, Tecumseh and the prophet established Prophetstown at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers in Indiana Territory. It was not merely a village, it was a declaration. The site lay on Miami land, yet followers from multiple tribes settled there without Miami permission. The message was deliberate. In this new order, territorial exclusivity was finished. The land was shared, and it would be occupied as a united people, not as fragments. Prophetstown expanded rapidly into a community unlike anything the region had seen. Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Winnebago, and others lived together, shared resources, and gathered in ceremonies that braided traditions without asking permission from old boundaries. It was Tecumseh's idea, given a physical shape. Unity not as a temporary alliance, but as a lived reality. The prophet's ceremonies reinforced that reality. He blended elements from multiple traditions into a pan-indigenous spiritual practice meant to transcend tribe and language. He identified witches, often leaders who cooperated with Americans or accepted Christian conversion, and subjected them to trials and executions that frightened missionaries and government officials. Those executions did more than claim purification. They served a political purpose. They removed accommodationist leaders and warned others who might consider cooperation. It was cultural revolution enforced through spiritual authority, and it worked. Within a few years, chiefs who once signed treaties found their legitimacy contested by prophet-aligned factions that rejected land cessions altogether. American officials watched Prophetstown with growing alarm. William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, understood the threat. The prophets' movement attacked the very machinery of expansion. If indigenous peoples refused land sales and treated unity as a religious command above tribal leadership, then the treaty system, the legal fiction that made dispossession look orderly, could begin to fail. Harrison tried to break the movement without firing a shot. He challenged the prophet to perform miracles, hoping to expose him as a fraud. Tenskwatawa answered by accurately predicting a solar eclipse in 1806, a moment that deepened his credibility and drew in new converts. Harrison turned to economic pressure, cutting off annuity payments to tribes that sent members to Prophetstown, but the movement's rejection of dependency blunted the threat. What could not be undone through diplomacy or leverage would eventually be tested by force. Tecumseh understood that as clearly as Harrison did. While his brother built the spiritual center, Tecumseh traveled constantly, moving from council to council, asking nations to see the pattern that had already swallowed so many. He did not demand that tribes abandon their identities or accept Shawnee rule. He asked them to recognize the shared danger, a common enemy pursuing a common end, total dispossession. He warned that spiritual renewal without coordinated resistance would collapse just as earlier wars had collapsed, and that military action without a deeper foundation would dissolve into the same old cycle of isolated courage and certain loss. Tecumseh's ambition went beyond a wartime coalition. He was trying to build permanence, a confederacy strong enough to negotiate as a single power, defend territory collectively, and hold cultural autonomy against a future of forced assimilation. It was nation-building concealed inside religious language, political revolution wrapped in prophecy, and for a brief moment it looked possible. Prophetstown grew. The message traveled faster than treaties. Leaders who had accommodated expansion watched their influence weaken as new factions formed around the prophet's authority. But inside the movement was a tension that could not stay contained. Tenskwatawa believed purification would bring divine intervention, a restoration that did not require disciplined coordination. Tecumseh believed the Spirit could unify people, but it could not replace strategy. In the end, he believed, they would have to fight, and they would have to fight together at the moment of greatest advantage. The question was whether Tecumseh could finish his diplomatic mission, uniting nations from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Before Harrison forced a confrontation, Prophetstown was not ready to survive. Because in 1811, while Tecumseh was traveling south to recruit the Creek and Cherokee, Harrison would march on Prophetstown with 1,000 soldiers. And the prophet, without his brother's guidance, would choose to strike first, a decision that would crack the movement's spiritual center and push Tecumseh toward the path he had tried to delay. Not negotiation, not reform, war. Between 1808 and 1811, Tecumseh traveled farther than perhaps any indigenous leader before him, moving thousands of miles through territories held by dozens of distinct nations. He was not leading war parties, he was not trading. He was attempting something unprecedented, building a continental political consciousness among peoples who had never been asked to see themselves as a single civilization. His method was direct, repetitive, and punishing. He arrived at villages and council grounds, requested permission to speak, and delivered speeches that could stretch for hours. He avoided translators when he could. He had learned multiple indigenous languages and preferred to place his message in the air without another voice between him and the listeners. When barriers were unavoidable, he used interpreters he trusted, men who could carry not only words, but the weight behind them. What he offered was not the usual rhetoric of the frontier. He did not flatter tribal pride. He did not summon ancient grudges. He did not promise easy victories or divine rescue. He did something more unsettling. He explained the mechanism. He described what was happening with a clarity that left little room for comfort, and he asked his audiences to look past their own borders and see the continent as a single unfolding pattern. First came the traders, tightening dependence on foreign goods. Then came the missionaries, teaching that old ways were shameful. Then came government agents, finding pliable leaders and rewarding them with gifts, titles, and recognition. Then came treaties, land exchanged for annuities and promises of permanent boundaries. Then came settlers who violated those boundaries as if the ink had never dried. Then came demands for new treaties to resolve the conflict created by the violations. And finally came military force, when refusal threatened to interrupt the process. Tecumseh told them this was not a series of accidents. It was a system. It had already been used from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, and it would keep moving until nothing remained. The only uncertainty was not the outcome, but the speed, how long each nation could delay the inevitable if it faced it alone. But they did not have to face it alone. That was his revolution. If indigenous peoples recognized that the land belonged to all of them collectively, if they rejected treaties signed by single tribes as illegitimate, if they coordinated resistance and refused to be isolated one by one, then perhaps they could force a negotiated peace that preserved autonomy. He was not calling for extermination of settlers or endless war. He was proposing a balance of power, a frontier strong enough that expansion would become too costly to continue. If the United States faced a unified resistance capable of coordinated action across the frontier, it would be pushed toward boundaries it could not simply violate without consequence. But the idea cut against the grain of traditional governance. Many native nations were built on consensus. Leaders held influence only as long as they retained community support. Chiefs could not command warriors. They persuaded them. And they could not easily commit their people to structures that placed tribal sovereignty beneath a larger political body. Tecumseh was asking them to do exactly that. He was asking nations to accept that decisions about war and peace, about treaties, territory, and resistance would be made collectively, not separately. It was a direct challenge to independence, offered as the price of survival. Many rejected him. Some saw Shawnee ambition hidden inside the language of unity. Others believed their existing relationships with the United States gave them better odds than joining a resistance movement. Some simply could not imagine stepping out of centuries of identity, rivalry, and memory for something as vast as continental unity. Yet others listened, and some believed. Around the Great Lakes, among the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Winnebago, Ottawa, and others, Tecumseh found audiences that did not need persuasion to fear the future. They had watched the Ohio nations lose their lands. They understood the sequence. They knew they were next. In the South, the reception fractured along internal lines. Tecumseh entered Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw territories in 1811 and delivered some of his most famous speeches. Among the Creek, he encountered a nation split against itself. Younger warriors, especially those drawn to the Red Stick faction, leaned toward his message of resistance and cultural renewal. Leaders committed to accommodation and those reshaping life around American models heard his words as a threat not only to peace, but to their authority. The Cherokee presented a different obstacle. Their strategy had been survival through adaptation. Written language, constitutional government, Christian churches, plantation agriculture supported by enslaved African labor. It was the opposite of Tecumseh's demand. Cherokee leaders listened with politeness and refused with certainty. They believed law, diplomacy, and civilization offered a better shield than confrontation. Tecumseh did not need everyone. He was building a coalition of the willing while exposing the cost of compromise. Every nation that joined made the next recruitment easier. Every respected leader who endorsed the vision gave others permission to imagine it. He was trying to generate momentum, to reach a point where unity would feed itself, where refusing would become the dangerous choice. At the center of his argument was a concept that challenged both American and indigenous assumptions about land. Tecumseh insisted that no individual, no single tribe, and no leader, however legitimate, had the right to sell what sustained generations and multiple peoples. The earth was not property to be broken into pieces and exchanged like trade goods. It was a trust. It belonged to all indigenous peoples collectively, including those not yet born. This was not a simple echo of older traditions. Many nations had clear territorial boundaries and exclusive use rights. Tecumseh was pushing something new, an innovation demanded by an unprecedented threat. The old framework had made divide and conquer possible. His framework was designed to make land cessions impossible without continental agreement. The implications were explosive. If land belonged to all indigenous peoples, then Greenville was illegitimate. Fort Wayne was illegitimate. Every treaty that carved territory west of the Appalachians could be rejected, because it had been signed by men who did not possess the right to sell what they did not exclusively own. The legal foundation of American expansion, the claim that dispossession was consensual, could be denied at the root. He carried this message from council to council. He slept little. He traveled constantly. He spoke until his voice went raw. He met leaders in secret when public agreement was dangerous, and in open gatherings when the moment allowed it. He shaped his language to local fears without surrendering the core vision. And he secured commitments, not always formal, not always reliable, that warriors would respond when the Confederation called. By 1811, Tecumseh had built something that had never truly existed, a loose but genuine alliance stretching from the Great Lakes toward the Gulf, nations agreeing, at least in principle, to reject further land cessions and coordinate resistance if the United States tried to take more by force. It was imperfect, incomplete, held together more by loyalty to Tecumseh than by institutions that could outlive him. But it was real, and Tecumseh understood what time could do for it. Given space to harden, to build communication, coordination, and habit, it might have changed the trajectory of expansion, not ended it entirely, but forced boundaries that held and preserved autonomy and territory in ways the treaty system was designed to prevent. He also understood how easily it could be broken. The longer unity remained informal, the more openings existed for American agents to undermine it, with bribery, threats, selective violence, and promises offered to the most anxious leaders. And he knew Harrison was watching Prophetstown with growing impatience, waiting for a justification to crush the movement before it could mature. So Tecumseh made a fateful choice. He would travel south one more time to recruit the Creek, a nation whose involvement could turn a regional confederacy into something truly continental. He would be gone for months, moving through territory where communication with Prophetstown would be thin or impossible. And he would leave Tenskwatawa in charge with explicit instructions: avoid confrontation, do not attack, do not give Harrison the war he wanted before the Confederation was ready. It was a calculated risk. Tecumseh was the strategist. The prophet was the spiritual center. Surely Tenskwatawa could hold the line, maintain discipline, and wait. But Tecumseh misjudged something fundamental. The prophet believed his own promises. He believed purification would be enough. He believed divine protection could replace planning. And when Harrison marched toward Prophetstown with 1,000 soldiers in November 1811, Tenskwatawa made the decision Tecumseh had tried to prevent, a decision that would tear open the movement's heart and leave Tecumseh with only one path forward: not persuasion, not patience, war, and an alliance with a foreign power that carried its own hunger. William Henry Harrison had been watching Prophetstown grow for 3 years. and every report sharpened his alarm. What began as a small religious community had become a city of more than 1,000 people from multiple nations, organized around principles that threatened American expansion at its foundation. Warriors were gathering, supplies were being stored, and most dangerous of all, treaty-signing chiefs were losing authority to younger leaders who rejected land cessions entirely. Harrison understood the danger better than most. As governor of Indiana Territory, his central task was land, acquiring it through treaties that opened space for American settlement. Between 1802 and 1809, he negotiated 15 treaties that transferred millions of acres to the United States. The machinery was reliable: identify compliant chiefs, offer gifts and annuities, secure signatures, and use force against any faction that refused to accept the result. Tecumseh's movement threatened to jam that machinery. In 1809, Harrison negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne, purchasing 3 million acres from Miami, Delaware, and Potawatomi leaders. Tecumseh denounced it publicly as illegitimate. The chiefs who signed, he argued, had no right to sell land that belonged to all indigenous peoples collectively, and he warned that if Americans tried to settle the ceded territory, there would be war. It was a direct challenge to American sovereignty and to the legal fiction that made expansion look orderly. If Tecumseh's argument spread, then every previous treaty could be questioned. Land titles settlers believed secure could be contested. Harrison's system, the slow, predictable conversion of homelands into property, risked collapsing into open instability. Harrison tried negotiation first. In August 1810, Tecumseh traveled to Vincennes to meet him. The encounter was tense, close to violence. Tecumseh arrived with warriors who ringed the meeting space in a deliberate display of force. Harrison met him with armed soldiers. Through interpreters, they clashed over legitimacy, land, and the future. Tecumseh was controlled and uncompromising. He explained that the Master of Life had created the continent for indigenous peoples as a whole, not as a set of tribal parcels to be sold away under pressure. He traced the pattern of American expansion and warned that accommodation ended the same way every time: disappearance. He demanded the United States halt settlement on Fort Wayne land and recognize the collective right of indigenous nations to their territories. Harrison did not bend. He insisted the land had been legally purchased from chiefs with recognized authority. He warned that resistance would be met with military force. He dismissed Tecumseh's pan-indigenous vision as unrealistic, and argued that tribes would be wiser to accept American terms while they still had any leverage at all. Neither convinced the other. Both left, knowing the conflict was no longer a question of principle, only of timing. Who would force the next step, and under what conditions? Through 1811, the pressure tightened. Settlers moved onto disputed land despite warnings. Hunting parties clashed with frontier families. Isolated killings occurred on both sides. Harrison sent reports to Washington describing Prophetstown as a growing threat that needed to be neutralized before it ignited a wider war. Tecumseh kept traveling, trying to complete his continental coalition before Harrison could provoke a confrontation on American terms. In September 1811, Harrison received authorization from Secretary of War William Eustis to act against Prophetstown if circumstances warranted. It was the permission he had wanted. He assembled a force of regulars and militia, over 1,000 men, supported by artillery. Publicly, the purpose was intimidation, pressure, the profit to disperse the settlement and send warriors back to their home nations. Privately, the aim was clearer: destroy the center before Tecumseh could return and turn it into something durable. Tecumseh learned of Harrison's preparations while in Creek territory. He sent urgent messages back to Prophetstown with explicit instructions for his brother. Avoid confrontation at all costs. Do not attack. Do not give Harrison the excuse he was seeking. Hold defensively and wait. The Confederation was not ready. Premature war would ruin everything. But Tenskwatawa was not a strategist. He was a spiritual leader whose authority rested on certainty, on promises of protection and restoration. When Harrison's army camped near Prophetstown on November 6, 1811, the prophet faced a crisis that was not only military but personal. His followers expected action. His claims demanded proof. Harrison's presence was a direct insult to everything he preached about indigenous strength and American weakness. The prophet consulted the spirits and delivered guidance that would become fatal. He told the warriors the master of life would shield them. Bullets would not harm them. The Americans would panic. Victory would come through spiritual power, not planning. All they needed was faith. Before dawn on November 7th, around 500 indigenous warriors struck Harrison's encampment. The attack was brave and initially effective. Sentries died. The camp erupted into confusion, but Harrison's troops were disciplined and well-armed. They formed defensive lines, brought artillery to bear, and answered with sustained fire. For 2 hours, the battle churned in darkness and smoke until the attackers pulled back, bloodied, exhausted, and unable to break the position. Tippecanoe was not a decisive battlefield defeat. Casualties were roughly equal, and Harrison's force was too battered to pursue. But strategically, it was catastrophic. The prophet's promise of protection collapsed in plain sight. Warriors who believed themselves invulnerable fell to ordinary bullets. In a single morning, the aura that had carried his message across the region began to drain away. The next day, Harrison burned Prophetstown. The spiritual and political heart of Tecumseh's project went up in smoke. Food stores meant to carry the community through winter were destroyed. The living symbol of pan-indigenous unity, the proof that nations could share one center, was reduced to ash. The prophet's credibility shattered with the town. Warriors began to drift away. Tribes weighing alliance hesitated, then stepped back. Traditional chiefs who had opposed the movement seized on Tippecanoe as evidence that accommodation was the only realistic path. When Tecumseh returned and learned what had happened, he reportedly grabbed his brother by the hair and threatened to kill him. Years of careful diplomacy had been undone by one reckless decision. The spiritual movement was discredited. The center was gone. The alliance began to splinter along the very seams Tecumseh had spent his life trying to stitch closed. Yet Tecumseh did not abandon the vision. Tippecanoe clarified what remained. Moral persuasion and spiritual revival were not enough. Unity achieved through voluntary agreement was too fragile to withstand American pressure. What was left was the oldest method: coordinated military resistance, sustained by an outside power strong enough to supply weapons, resources, and a counterweight to American expansion. The War of 1812 was approaching. Britain and the United States were sliding toward conflict over maritime rights, territorial disputes, and rival visions for North America. Britain needed indigenous allies to defend Canada and threaten the American frontier. Tecumseh needed British support to keep resistance alive. Arms, coordination, and the possibility of forcing negotiation through pain rather than argument. It was not an alliance built on trust. The British had their own history of using indigenous allies and discarding them when convenient. Tecumseh knew that, but he had run out of clean options. Tippecanoe proved that prophecy could not stop artillery, and that Harrison would destroy any indigenous center before it could become lasting power. War was no longer something to be avoided by patient diplomacy. War became the only arena in which Tecumseh's unity might survive at all. If indigenous warriors fighting alongside British regulars could inflict enough damage, perhaps a negotiated peace would preserve some autonomy. If enough nations joined and coordinated, perhaps the United States would conclude expansion was too costly to continue, at least for a time. It was a desperate hope forged out of shrinking space. But Tecumseh had always known this moment might arrive. when every diplomatic path closed and survival required risking everything in open confrontation. The question now was whether nations that could not unite in peace would unite in war, and whether British support would prove more durable than the promises that had already broken so many times before. In 1812, when the United States declared war on Britain, Tecumseh travelled to Fort Malden in Upper Canada and offered the British an alliance that would shape the early years of the conflict. He did not bring a finished continental confederation. Tippecanoe had ended that possibility, but he brought something nearly as valuable: a reputation, a vision, and the personal loyalty of enough warriors to matter in the battles ahead. The war Tecumseh tried to prevent through unity was now unavoidable, and he would fight it not as the architect of a continent-wide nation, but as a commander allied to an empire that would keep him close only as long as he remained useful, and discard him the moment calculations shifted. When Tecumseh arrived at Fort Malden in June 1812, the British officers were skeptical. They had worked with indigenous allies for decades and believed they understood the pattern. Warriors fought hard when victory looked close, then drifted away after defeats, or when the rhythms of hunting and survival demanded their attention. British officers also carried their own assumptions about indigenous warfare: raids, speed, individual reputation, minimal casualties, not the sustained campaigns European armies depended on. They wanted allies who would hold ground through weeks of pressure, not fighters who could disappear into the tree line the moment a battle turned. Tecumseh did not fit their expectations, and the British recognized it quickly. He arrived with roughly 2,000 warriors from multiple tribes who accepted his leadership in ways that unsettled European ideas about indigenous organization. More than numbers, he brought purpose. Tecumseh saw the war in continental terms. For Britain, victory meant checking American expansion. For indigenous peoples, British defeat meant something worse than a lost campaign. It meant the final compression of their world, the last narrowing of autonomy into nothing. Major General Isaac Brock, commanding British forces in Upper Canada, saw what others missed: an indigenous leader who combined tactical instinct with strategic intelligence, and who possessed the personal authority to keep warriors committed through hardship. Within weeks, Brock and Tecumseh developed a mutual respect that would define the early war. Their first collaboration became one of the war's most startling moments: the capture of Detroit in August 1812. American General William Hull had invaded Upper Canada with more than 2,000 troops, then retreated back to Detroit when his supply lines came under threat. Brock had fewer than 1,500 soldiers and militia. Tecumseh brought around 600 warriors. Together they constructed an illusion large enough to break Hull's nerve. Tecumseh's warriors moved through the forests where American sentries could see them, then circled back and marched past again, repeating the movement until it looked like an endless flow of fighters. Brock sent demands for surrender with carefully calibrated menace, hinting at what might happen if indigenous warriors were forced to storm the fort and could not be restrained. Hull, terrified of slaughter and convinced he faced overwhelming numbers, surrendered without firing a shot. It was a bloodless victory that secured the northwest frontier for Britain and confirmed Tecumseh's value. But it also exposed the tension at the core of the alliance. Brock valued Tecumseh because he could mobilize warriors and synchronize them with British operations. Yet British strategy served imperial survival, not indigenous sovereignty. The alliance worked when their interests overlapped. It would strain the moment they did not. After Detroit, Tecumseh and his forces moved through the northwest in a series of engagements that tested discipline and endurance. At the River Racine in January 1813, indigenous and British forces defeated a larger American army in brutal winter fighting. At Fort Meigs in May 1813, Tecumseh led warriors in a siege that held down a major American force for weeks. British officers who had doubted indigenous effectiveness watched him maintain order among fighters from many nations and began to understand how rare that was. But the war was not unfolding in the way Tecumseh needed. British commanders treated the Northwest as a secondary theatre. Their central anxieties were Montreal, the St. Lawrence, and control of the Great Lakes. When resources ran thin, indigenous allies received what remained after regulars were supplied. When priorities shifted, indigenous interests were quietly pushed aside. The most devastating shift came in September 1813, when American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British fleet on Lake Erie. British control of the lakes had been the spine of their western defense. Once that spine snapped, supply lines to the western forts became impossible to sustain. Major General Henry Proctor, who had replaced Brock after Brock's death, immediately began planning a retreat toward the Niagara frontier. Tecumseh argued against retreat with a force that was more accusation than debate. Abandoning the Northwest meant abandoning indigenous land to American occupation. Warriors had joined because British partnership held out the promise of defense. Retreat broke that promise and would shatter what remained of unity. If they had to fight, they should fight where they stood, on the ground that mattered, not retreat until nothing was left behind them but ashes and memory. But Proctor had orders, and more than orders, priorities. British casualties could be replaced. British territory in Canada had to be held at any cost. Indigenous allies were valuable, but not indispensable if keeping them meant risking Canada itself. Proctor would retreat. Tecumseh's warriors could follow, or they could be left to face Harrison alone. Tecumseh understood what that meant. Without British ammunition, supplies and coordination, resistance would collapse within weeks. He convinced his warriors to follow, even as faith in British reliability began to split. They had fought well. They had won victories. And now they were being asked to surrender the land they were fighting for because British naval power had failed on the lakes. The retreat up the Thames River in October 1813 became chaotic and corrosive. Proctor moved too fast, leaving supplies behind, failing to create strong defensive positions. His relationship with Tecumseh hardened into contempt. British soldiers sensed panic in their command and lost confidence. Indigenous warriors watched men who had spoken of partnership move like fugitives, and wondered with growing bitterness whether this alliance had ever been meant to protect indigenous futures or only to buy time for an empire. On October 5, 1813, American forces under William Henry Harrison caught them near Moraviantown on the Thames River. Proctor wanted to keep retreating. Tecumseh insisted they stand. The warriors were exhausted, supply lines were broken, and another flight would finish morale. Better to fight with some dignity than to run until running became surrender. Proctor agreed to form a defensive line, but chose the ground poorly and deployed his troops badly. He placed British regulars across the road in thin ranks vulnerable to a mounted charge. He positioned Tecumseh's warriors in the forest on the flank, separated from the British centre, unable to coordinate with it. There were no strong fortifications, no meaningful preparations, no posture that suggested a commander who believed in the defense he was ordering. It was a line made to be broken. British soldiers knew it. Indigenous warriors knew it. And when Harrison's Kentucky mounted infantry charged, the British centre collapsed almost immediately. Proctor fled with much of what remained of his force, abandoning the indigenous fighters still engaged in the forest. Tecumseh found himself in the worst kind of battle, one where allies had already quit the field, where his warriors were being pressed from multiple directions, where the strategic position offered no real path to victory. He could have withdrawn. He could have saved himself, preserved leadership for whatever resistance might survive the disaster. But Tecumseh had spent his life asking others to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. He had demanded they hold when others ran, fight when others surrendered. Believe in unity when history gave them every reason to doubt it. Now, with British faith broken and his political project bleeding out, he made the choice that had always been waiting beneath his words. He would not ask warriors to die for a vision he would not die for. He would not save himself while others fought in the woods with no hope and no reinforcement. He would stand where he had told others to stand. And if the cost was his life, then he would pay it without negotiation. As American forces closed in and the fight collapsed into desperate close-quarters chaos in the trees, Tecumseh placed himself at the center of the resistance and prepared for a final stand, not because he believed he could win, but because someone had to prove that indigenous peoples would not accept a future defined entirely by their conquerors. The Battle of the Thames was over before it truly began for the British regulars. Harrison's Kentucky mounted infantry smashed through Proctor's thin defensive line within minutes. Men ordered to hold a position their commander had not prepared broke almost immediately. Proctor fled so fast he left behind personal papers and his military chest. The British regulars, who had fought effectively at Detroit and Fort Meigs, dissolved into retreat, and in doing so abandoned their indigenous allies to fight alone. In the forest to the British right, Tecumseh's warriors held swampy woodland that should have been ideal defensive ground. They took cover behind trees and fallen logs, shaping overlapping lines of fire that forced attackers into narrow, exposed approaches. Under different circumstances, with coordination, support, and a center that did not collapse, they might have held for hours. But circumstances were not different. The British break meant the indigenous position was already being flanked. American forces could focus almost entirely on the forest fight without fear for their own line. And Tecumseh's warriors, however disciplined and well-placed, carried limited ammunition and had no way to resupply, reinforce, or retreat as a coherent body under pressure. Tecumseh read the situation instantly. There would be no clever maneuver, no speech strong enough to reverse the geometry of the field. The British had betrayed them again, not necessarily out of hatred, but out of calculation. British soldiers could be replaced, imperial positions could be defended elsewhere, and indigenous allies could be sacrificed when the balance demanded it. He could have ordered withdrawal. His warriors would have followed him into the woods, splitting into small groups that could evade pursuit, regroup later, and preserve what remained of their strength. Tecumseh was experienced enough to know there was no virtue in dying for nothing. Survival mattered if survival still had meaning. But what meaning was left now? The British were retreating toward Niagara and would not return to the northwest. Without British arms and supply, sustained resistance would collapse quickly. The Confederation had already begun to fracture after Tippecanoe. This defeat would finish what Tippecanoe started, and there was something deeper than logistics. Tecumseh's authority had never rested on title alone. It rested on example. He had asked warriors to sacrifice for unity. He had demanded they hold when retreat would have been easier, fight when the future looked closed, trust a cause larger than their own lives. If he saved himself while they died, what would his words become afterward? Prophecy or performance? So Tecumseh chose not to retreat, not because he believed in pointless death, but because he understood what was dying here. If the vision of united resistance was going to end on this river, it would not end as a scramble, not as an abandonment, not as another story of leaders escaping while others paid the cost. It would end with a leader standing where he told others to stand. He positioned himself near the center of the line and prepared for the assault. The warriors saw him and understood what he was choosing. Some accounts suggest he accepted he would not survive the day. Others suggest he fought with the stubborn hope that something, anything, might shift if they held long enough. Either way, the commitment was visible. The Americans pushed into the trees through mud and cover. Kentucky militiamen, many carrying personal hatred from years of frontier violence, advanced with a fury that turned the fighting into close-range chaos. Trees hid movement. Smoke and shadow erased distance. The battle broke down into sudden encounters, single shots, brief struggles, a war reduced to faces and breath and panic. In that confusion, someone shot Tecumseh. Accounts differ on who. What matters is what followed. He was struck multiple times, wounds that would have been fatal even with immediate aid. He fell among his warriors. He did not leave the field. Around him, men kept firing and falling as American numbers and ammunition pressed into positions that could not endure without support. Within an hour of Tecumseh's death, the resistance in the forest began to collapse. Warriors who had held while he stood started to withdraw once he fell. Some carried wounded comrades. Others vanished into the trees in small groups, the cohesion gone with the one presence that had held it together. The battle ended with British forces in flight and indigenous fighters scattered and broken. But Tecumseh's story did not conclude with a grave. His body was never conclusively identified. In the aftermath, American soldiers looted corpses and took trophies. Multiple bodies were claimed to be his. Some Kentucky militiamen reportedly skinned corpses they believed were Tecumseh's, turning human skin into razor strops. A detail as grotesque as it is revealing of what victory can become when hatred is given permission. Survivors tried to recover him and could not. Some said his followers hid the body to prevent desecration. Others said it was never recovered at all, lost among the dead in the forest, swallowed by confusion and fear. The uncertainty bred legend. Some believed he had not died, that he had been taken away and would return when needed. Others claimed to know where he was buried but refused to speak, protecting the secret from grave robbers and those who would turn him into a spectacle. The absence of a confirmed body allowed Tecumseh to become myth as well as memory. What was certain was the consequence. The Confederation collapsed within weeks. Without Tecumseh's personal authority, bridging old rivalries and competing interests, the alliance broke apart along familiar lines. Some nations sought separate peace. Others resisted sporadically, but without coordination, without direction, without a center. The idea of pan-indigenous unity did not die because it lacked courage. It died because it lost the one man capable of holding it together long enough to become real. Then came the final confirmation of what Tecumseh had feared about empires. In the peace that ended the War of 1812, indigenous sovereignty was not protected. The Treaty of Ghent restored pre-war boundaries between the United States and Britain and made no provisions for indigenous land rights. Britain agreed to end support for resistance in American territory. Peoples who had fought and died in the hope of defending their homelands were not even present as parties to the settlement. Harrison, who had pursued Tecumseh for years, carried the victory into politics. The battle was mythologized in American memory as civilization triumphant. The last great resistance in the Northwest broken, the Ohio Valley opened wider than ever. For indigenous peoples across the continent, Tecumseh's death marked the end of the last realistic hope for unified resistance. Other leaders would fight later and suffer the same narrowing of options, but none would come as close to Tecumseh's attempt to build something continental, durable and political, rather than merely martial. And so the question that haunted survivors remained: was Tecumseh right? Was unity truly possible, something that could have worked with more time? Or was it always a dream too large to survive old conflicts, British limits, and American force? The answer would never be known, because the experiment ended in a forest at the Thames River, with a leader falling under gunfire and a body that could not be found, leaving a continent to continue breaking apart without the one vision that tried to hold it together. History remembers Tecumseh as a warrior, and he was certainly that. He fought in dozens of battles, showed tactical brilliance, and died weapon in hand defending ground he knew could not be held. But reducing Tecumseh to a warrior erases what made him extraordinary, and why his failure carries more weight than most victories. Tecumseh was, at his core, a diplomat operating at a scale indigenous North America had never attempted. He traveled thousands of miles through territories held by dozens of distinct nations, spoke multiple languages, navigated old rivalries, and tried to build political consensus among peoples who had spent generations defining themselves apart from one another. This was not conquest, it was not conversion, it was politics in its purest form, the attempt to create collective identity and shared purpose among people with every reason to remain divided. The challenge was close to impossible. Each nation carried its own governance, spiritual traditions, grievances, and calculations. The Creek and Cherokee had histories of hostility. Northern woodland nations viewed southern agricultural societies with suspicion. Languages were mutually unintelligible. Decision-making processes varied dramatically. And everywhere there were leaders who believed their older methods, selective diplomacy, accommodation, legal appeals, offered better odds than joining an untested resistance that asked them to surrender a measure of sovereignty. Tecumseh had to address all of this diversity without losing coherence. He could not promise easy victories because indigenous peoples had heard such promises before and watched them dissolve into grief. He could not simply invoke tribal pride because tribal identity was precisely what he needed to stretch beyond its limits. He could not rely on religious authority alone because spiritual worlds did not align neatly across the continent. So he offered something colder and stronger, political vision grounded in pattern and consequence. He documented the mechanism of American expansion, predicted its continuation, and argued that isolated resistance was not merely ineffective, it was suicidal. His speeches were not only emotion, they were logic sharpened into warning, forcing audiences to look at power as it was, not as they wished it to be. That is what made Tecumseh dangerous and modern. He was proposing something genuinely new, not a temporary wartime coalition, but a permanent restructuring of indigenous politics. A confederacy of nations that would pool sovereignty for collective defense, reject individual land sales, coordinate diplomatic and military responses, and negotiate with the United States as a unified power. It was nation-building spoken aloud. Constitutional thinking expressed through councils instead of paper. Tecumseh understood that survival required more than battlefield courage. It required structures that could survive distance, pressure, and time. He was trying to create indigenous political modernity in response to a modern imperial state, the very kind of state dismantling older indigenous systems with treaties, courts, and settlement. As a unifier, he achieved something unprecedented, even in failure. He convinced warriors from the Great Lakes to the Gulf to see themselves inside a shared struggle rather than a collection of separate emergencies. He helped create networks through which information and intention could move across enormous space. He built personal relationships with leaders who trusted him even when they hesitated before his vision. That unity was fragile. Tippecanoe cracked it. His death ended it. But for a brief period, something existed that had not existed before. Peoples of vastly different cultures recognizing common cause and coordinating action around shared political principles rather than temporary convenience. He was also a cultural strategist who understood that political unity needed a foundation deeper than fear. This is where his brother's movement mattered. The prophet's message of cultural revival and rejection of European corruption gave emotional and spiritual justification to what Tecumseh argued in practical terms. It turned survival into obligation. It made unity feel sacred. But Tecumseh never allowed spirituality to replace strategy. Unlike Tenskwatawa, he did not believe faith alone could stop bullets. Cultural revival to him was a base, not a substitute. The tension between spiritual certainty and strategic realism broke them at Tippecanoe. Yet it also revealed Tecumseh's complexity, a leader able to move through multiple worlds, diplomacy, warfare, cultural renewal, without confusing any one tool for the entire solution. What makes Tecumseh a lost symbol rather than a celebrated hero is that he represents a future that never arrived. If his confederation had held, if indigenous nations had unified and forced negotiated boundaries that the United States could not casually violate, North America would look different. Indigenous peoples might have remained autonomous political entities rather than being reduced to dependent populations. The continent might have become a space of multiple sovereignties instead of one expanding empire. That future was probably impossible given the disparities in population, resources, and state power, but probably is not certainly. Tecumseh came closer than anyone to testing the question honestly. His failure was not pure fate. It was shaped by contingency, Tippecanoe's premature battle, British priorities at the Thames, and the simple truth that building unprecedented unity requires time, the one resource history refused to grant. This is why Tecumseh becomes a warning as much as a figure. He shows what happens when peoples facing existential threat cannot overcome division fast enough to mount effective resistance. Indigenous nations had courage, experience, and knowledge of the land. What they lacked was a unified political instrument, and by the time a leader emerged who could imagine one, the window was already closing. The parallel is uncomfortable because it is not unique. How often do communities see a threat approaching, understand what is coming, agree that unity is necessary, and still fail to achieve it until the conditions for resistance are gone? How many leaders have been right about the diagnosis and still lost because they could not persuade enough people to accept the cure before it was too late? Tecumseh's story is not only about resistance to American expansion. It is about the eternal difficulty of collective action under pressure, the impossibility of building new structures while old ones are breaking, the way fear and tradition can keep people separate even when separation guarantees defeat. It is about leaders who can see the future clearly and still watch it arrive unchanged. What Tecumseh really was, in the end, was a man who understood what was coming and could not make enough people believe him in time to stop it. He saw that indigenous peoples would have to become something they had never been, a unified political force capable of acting across continental distances. He had vision, charisma, strategic intelligence, and moral authority. What he lacked was time. By 1813, when he died in a forest at the Thames, American expansion had already pushed too far to be reversed. Too many treaties had been signed, too many settlers had moved west, too much territory had been lost. Too many leaders had committed to accommodation. Even if Tecumseh had survived and continued organizing, the conditions for a successful continental resistance were already deteriorating toward collapse. But that does not make his attempt meaningless. Tecumseh demonstrated that indigenous peoples were capable of the same political sophistication and strategic imagination that Americans celebrated in their own founders. He proved conquest was not simply destiny. Our indigenous nations had agency, leadership, and capacity, and defeat came from specific pressures and decisions, not from any lack of human worth. More than that, he left a template. Later movements would echo parts of his vision: the impulse toward unity, the attempt to bind culture to resistance, even when none could recreate the moment he tried to manufacture. His failure became instruction: what was attempted, what almost formed, and what might have been possible under different conditions. The tragedy is not that Tecumseh tried and failed. The tragedy is that he was likely right about what survival required, and that indigenous nations could not overcome division fast enough to implement it before American power made resistance unsustainable. That is the warning buried in his life. Sometimes you can see exactly what must be done and still be unable to do it, because history moves faster than people can change. And sometimes the leaders who see most clearly die fighting for futures that will never exist, leaving behind not certainty, but the haunted question of what might have been if more had listened sooner, unified faster, and acted before the moment passed into the past for good. Tecumseh did not lose a single war. He lost the only war that mattered, the war against division. When Tecumseh fell, his confederation did not collapse because it lacked courage. It collapsed because history had never made room for what he was trying to build. A native continent, not tribes surviving, but a civilization standing, and with his death, that future disappeared. If this story mattered, subscribe to Fragments of History. Leave a like so these documentaries can reach more people. And in the comments, which leader should we explore next?